Alright, so today I'm going to show you guys how I write basically all of my stories. I'm sure that there are other writers who do this. I'm sure that maybe we all just kind of think about the same aspects of writing and we just implement them in different ways. So I'd be surprised if there was nobody in the world who writes with this kind of framework or this approach. I want to share how I use this framework and why it works for me. I have mentioned this in passing in vlogs and other videos, and essentially what it comes down to is a dialogue first approach. I feel like every time I bring this up to other writers, whether it's like in a video or in real life, I always get questions about how I do this, and I'm just gonna break down this method and how I use it and why I feel like it actually helps me write faster. I feel like many people, I get distracted really easily. And whenever I get distracted in my writing, it stops me from like continuing on in a scene. Like if I get distracted because I'm stuck, I'll just kind of like take a break, and then sometimes I won't feel like writing anymore, which leads me to my second point and the other reason that I feel like this method really helps. Motivation and keeping the flow of my writing session. It stops me from getting stuck because it allows me to skip over certain parts. Third reason that this method works for me is that it allows me to procrastinate the less exciting parts of the scene. And nothing is more of a roadblock for me in my writing than hitting a part of a scene that's not fun to write or that's just not as exciting. And rather than pushing through that, I just skip over it. So with this method, I can focus on sort of overcoming the blank page by just writing the parts that I do find exciting and leaving the other parts to later. So before I jump into an example, I'm just gonna break down this framework at a glance. Now, a dialogue first approach is exactly what it sounds like. I just write only the dialogue. There's a couple of reasons why I've kind of adapted this, and I think firstly, I find dialogue the most exciting part of my writing sessions. Dialogue is my favorite thing to write, and it might not be everyone's favorite thing to write, but if you enjoy character writing, if you enjoy writing dialogue and you've never done this method before, I would highly recommend it. You can really get a feel for your character's dynamics without having to get stuck writing a little bit of dialogue and then writing description. You have to be in a certain mood to enjoy writing description and atmosphere. That's why I kind of split it up in this way. The reason that I find dialogue so exciting is because there is a rhythm to it, and I have a lot of fun sort of figuring out what that rhythm is in a scene. Of course, what your characters are saying are just as important as what they're not saying, and I feel like it's almost this game to figure out what is a character actually saying to another character, like what are they being upfront about versus what is actually going through their head. I personally like to write the external stuff first, so I just have a lot of fun figuring out what the conversation feels like and how it's flowing, and everything else I write around that dialogue. You can really get to know and explore your characters' personalities. When you write out all your dialogue first and you're just looking at a page of only dialogue, no external descriptions, nothing else, you're essentially looking at a transcript, it really forces you as a writer to think about how your characters are speaking to each other without all of the other like flourishes and context yet. It makes you connect with your character's voice and external personality. The next thing that I do after dialogue is dialogue tags and gestures. So this is like he said, she said, they said. Could also be adjectives and adverbs like she said excitedly, or character movement, so how they might be moving about the scene. So let's say they sit up or they stand or they lie down, that kind of stuff. And then usually around this time, I'll also start filling out key external descriptions. So that might be setting. If they sit down at a table, I might describe the table or put down a couple sentences for what the room looks like. Like I said, I write all of that external stuff first. And then the next thing that I'll usually fill in, and this will kind of bleed into step 2. It really just depends on my mood, but for the most part, I think that I tend to focus on external stuff first, just so I can get my bearings on a scene. But the next step will be all the more internal stuff. So anything to build out atmosphere. If a character says something to another character and the perspective character, it makes them feel a certain emotion, then this is around the time that I'll write out the paragraphs where the perspective character is internalizing that emotion or they're processing that information. And the very last thing that I'll write is scene transitions. If literally the conversation is over and then the characters are moving from like one place to another, or they're moving across town or something, those kinds of scene transitions, they're usually like 1 or 2 sentences or maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs depending on the scene. And those are usually not as exciting for me, especially if I'm just writing it purely for continuity. It's not my favorite thing to write, so I'll usually just leave that to the end. So now that I've broken down the framework, I'm going to quickly show you guys an example. What I've done is I've laid out a scene from one of my old manuscripts. So this is Project Moon. This was my YA fantasy that I'm no longer working on, but that I did work on for a while a couple years ago. Scene 2 from chapter 1. I feel like it's pretty easy to read this scene out of context. We're going to be looking at some first draft prose. This has not been edited from a year or 2 ago now. So yeah, just fair warning, this is not an invitation to critique this piece of writing, but I feel like this video won't be useful if I don't show you guys an example. So just to give like very, very basic context, there are 3 characters in this scene. One character is not talking, so there's 2 primary characters that are actually talking. The perspective character is Kyra. She has just been released from prison and she doesn't know why. When she steps outside, she sees one of her childhood acquaintances, and that is the second character who's talking in this scene. His name is Mito, and essentially Mito is not really being forthcoming about why she's been released from prison, and so she's kind of trying to pry some details out of him, but Mito is being kind of coy about it. Let's take a look at it. This is the dialogue that I've laid out. This is, for me, usually the most fun part about a writing session. As you can see, I literally lay the dialogue out like a script. I don't fill in any details. I usually won't even fill in who's talking, because especially in a scene where there's only 2 people talking, I know who's talking, and I think as writers we know our scenes so well, so I don't waste time writing like notes for myself about who's speaking, because I know who's speaking. Like I was mentioning earlier, I just will literally like stream of consciousness write out the dialogue like it's a transcript. And if I get ideas for certain gestures or descriptions along the way, I might stop to do that. But for the most part, I just go straight with the dialogue. Now, one thing that I do that it's not clear here, I might, after I lay out the dialogue, if this is the start of a new scene, I usually don't start my scenes straight with dialogue. Like, I only do that a couple times in a manuscript. So for the most part, I might do something like this, where I'll leave a note for myself about how I want the scene to open, but I won't actually write it. So I might say something like opening description setting, or something like Kyra steps outside, describe landscape, or whatever, right? That's just a note for myself to remember to do that. The other thing that I do, because there is such a rhythm to dialogue, and figuring out the right pauses in the conversation where the perspective character might stop to process what they've heard, or they might stop to think carefully about what they're saying next, or if there's like a pause in the conversation, I kind of like to lay out where that's going to happen as I'm writing the dialogue. So if I look at something like this first line here, there she is, that's Mito. Then Kyra says, Mito, what is this? This is her expressing surprise. And then they go back and forth about like the whole situation. Mito is being very dodgy and playful because he doesn't want to tell her the whole story because he's not allowed to. Kyra is very suspicious, and she's told that she's being released on the authority of the Empire, which is an entity that she doesn't trust. So she's just doubtful, and she expresses that doubt. And then she finally asks, really, why are you here? So if I was laying this out, for example, I might think to myself, okay, Kyra's gonna take a long pause here. So what I'll do is I'll just like add a little paragraph break, and I know here that this means that she's gonna take a pause. I don't actually write out what is going through her head yet. I'll usually do that much later. Again, here, this is where Mito essentially concedes after he initially tries to be dodgy. So that's another area where I might do another pause or another paragraph break to indicate to me that it's a pause, and that here is where a significant amount of description might happen. It's just kind of an overview of what the dialogue part looks like. I'll show you guys the next step. Okay, so what I've done is I've highlighted all the stuff that I've added. Here you can see what I was talking about earlier with adding in that extra note for myself. So I actually wrote up here that the opening is internal reflection into Mito intro. Basically what this means is that I wanted the start of the scene to open up on Kyra doing some kind of reflection on whatever her internal conflict is. In this case, it is the fact that she is being released from prison but doesn't know why. And I wanted that paragraph to dovetail into Mito's character introduction. So that was just a note for myself. But again, I don't write it right away. I'll go straight into the external stuff. So here's the original dialogue. There she is. And then I add in the description of Mito and some of the basic character gestures. So Mito stood beaming in front of a gilded carriage, its side bearing the imperial crest, and sauntered over with that awful self-important grace. She squinted through the sunlight. So again, this is all external stuff, right? Just flat, straight up description. Here is a little bit more description on the gestures. So here and here, just adding in some more context on like how they're moving while they're talking. Here I describe Mito's laugh, and then there's an introduction of a third character who doesn't actually talk in the scene. So then I add in that one sentence of his character description. Again, more character description about physical appearance, adding in dialogue tags, more gestures and movements. So nothing too crazy. Usually though, around this time that I'm starting to describe the external actions, I'll start getting ideas for how I want the prospective character to be like processing their emotions. Here is a line that is pretty internal. This is Kyra sort of passing some judgment onto Mito's character to just kind of plant the seed of doubt. She calls him a politician's son, which again kind of contributes to his character description. Pretty straightforward, but you can kind of see how the gestures and the dialogue tags start to round out the scene. One thing that you'll notice is that I actually don't really like to use dialogue tags. If I'm looking at this scene, I only used it 3-ish times. And that's because there's only 2 people talking in this scene. And I think when there's only 2 people talking, you don't always have to indicate with he said, she said, who's talking, because it's pretty clear to the reader. So in the place of dialogue tags, I'll often use like character gestures because I think they're a lot more evocative. This could have easily been Kyra said Mito. The reason I like to use character movements and gestures and descriptions, like if I can get away with it instead of a dialogue tag, is because it's just a lot more evocative. And then lastly, I will usually leave like an outro note to myself, provided that the scene isn't ending on dialogue. So here I said, fade out to Cillian Harbor, reflection on Kyra's trepidation. So I think this basically what this means is that they're making their way to a ship, and so I wanted the last shot to be like sort of a sweeping shot of the harbor that they're approaching, and then to have at least one sentence where Kyra kind of like reflects on how worried she feels. Again, I've highlighted the new additions. The note that I left for myself was opening internal reflection into Mito intro. And so last thing I'll do is I'll finally fill out all of those blanks and details. So what I wrote is, Kyra had not prayed in prison. She had never been very good at it. By now, she'd long accepted that the Durrican goddesses probably did not like her all that much. That was how she knew this was not some act of divine intervention. It was something much worse. And like most troublesome things, it came in the form of Mito Testament. That's the start of the scene. Again, this is the external description that we added in the previous section. And then I added this here where Kyra, when she sees Mito, she has kind of this like pause to give kind of context on his character a little bit. And she says, he was waving at her as if they were kids again, studying together at the Temperance. as if an entire war hadn't sparked and ended in the years since they'd seen each other. Those are the kinds of things that I'll usually add in later in a scene because it goes deeper than surface level. It like gives context on the character dynamics. It's like reflective in the sense that it's Kyra, you know, passing her judgment on his character. So it goes deeper than just describing physical appearance, and that kind of stuff usually, it requires more time for me to think about, which is why it usually, there are exceptions to this, it doesn't usually get added until later on. And the other thing I added after some more physical description on the third character, I added this extra paragraph where she says, she glanced at Mito again. If he was here with an official escort, it meant he really was a royal envoy, proudly adorned with the mark of the blue orchid. That was new. So this is an external description, but the reason that this is something that I think that I added in after was because it kind of like is used as not an info dump, but sort of like an expository detail. It's like a world building detail. And so sometimes when I'm, you know, writing, when I reread the scene over, I'll think to myself like, oh, maybe the reader needs like a little bit more details about the world. And so I'll add in world building detail. That usually comes later. I won't always stop to write exposition because writing exposition isn't necessarily fun for me all the time either. So usually that also is something that comes in a little bit later. Here's another example of something that often comes later on. Here he reaches out and tussles her hair, and then I added in an old habit of his, one she hoped he'd have broken by now. It made her feel small, as if a decade were between them instead of a year. So that's just the kind of thing where when I read over the scene, I realize, oh, maybe I could add in a little bit more context about their relationship and the fact that they've known each other since they were kids. Similarly here, his gaze was level, calm, and yet in that strange calmness she understood. His orders were to drag her back to the Empire at all costs. Orders not from Tian to Mito, but from a prince to his liege. Yeah, so the primary sentiment of this scene is supposed to be Kyra's distrust about this whole situation. And prior to the start of the book, there was a crazy thing that happened between Kyra and the crown, and specifically between Kyra and the prince, whose name is Tian. And she, like, flash forward 3 years, which is when this scene takes place, she hears that she's being, like, basically ordered to be released from prison and to like stand before the crown. She's like suspicious because she knows that these people aren't to be trusted. So that's why I've added in just more of that doubt. Like in the final note that I had for myself here, fade out to Cillian Harbor, reflection on Kyra's trepidation, I wrote, inside the carriage, she stared at the plush velvet seats, at her hands clutched tightly at the fabric of her ragged uniform. Some hours later, the Cillian Harbor appeared before them. Her eyes drifted to Mito's rakish smile, and she wondered if perhaps she had just been freed from one prison only to be escorted to another. It's the end of chapter 1. The other thing is that I usually go into every scene knowing what needs to be accomplished. I always try to know what my goal of the scene is. And so, like I said, the goal of the scene for this is that you really start to feel distrust and the suspicions that Kyra has, but she has no choice but to go with them because the alternative is to stay in this prison. And so as long as I always go into my scenes having a goal for what the scene is going to be, it's really easy for me to sort of build around it and build the atmosphere and add in descriptions with intention. So with all of that said, I feel like it's important to kind of bring up some disclaimers / caveats of this writing method. I don't think that this is necessarily a method that's, you know, perfect for everyone. I think, like I said, if you enjoy writing dialogue, this could be for you. If you're a pantser that doesn't write with an outline, this might not work for you. If you don't have a roadmap, it can be harder to jump around, I think. One thing that I do that I didn't show in this example is sometimes I might do this across like 2 to 3 chapters at a time. So I might write out all the dialogue for one chapter, and if I'm like still in a flow state, I'll write out all the dialogue of the next chapter and maybe even into a third chapter. I usually try not to go too far because at some point you do need to fill in the blanks of the dialogue. So that's why I kind of see this as a bit of a non-linear writing technique. It works for me because I have an outline for the entire book. So I always roughly know what is supposed to happen in every single chapter. If you don't have an outline, you can still attempt to do this, I think. If you maybe just like outline a few chapters at a time, you can still probably implement this technique in some way. And the other thing is, like, if dialogue isn't an exciting thing for you to write, this might not be a method for you. However, I do think it can be adapted so that atmosphere and setting description is the most exciting part of writing. Then maybe you do all of that and then you do that first instead. And then if you reach like a stretch of dialogue that you don't want to write, you can just leave a note for yourself to write that dialogue later and then keep going. The point of this is to just show that you can jump around in your scenes a little bit, and it actually helps keep your flow. Because sometimes I'm just not in the mood to find the perfect sentences to describe what the sky looks like or what a city looks like, and I don't want to like spend my mental energy on that. And if I'm feeling really tired and demotivated, that's not the most exciting part of the scene to write for me. So I kind of just give myself the license to skip over it. It also makes me feel like I'm keeping up the momentum, which is why it helps me write faster. Because if I load up my manuscript, I'm stuck on a part of a scene or a part of the chapter that I just don't want to write, then sometimes it stops me from writing altogether. I hope all of your writing projects are going well. Let me know if this is a method that any of you guys already use, or a variation of it if you already use it. That is all. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.
Hey, put it in a G-Cal, I just wanna see you with a spot round.